What would you do if your mother-in-law suddenly booked a 2-week visit, bringing her sons without asking, and expected to stay in your tiny apartment, while you're home alone with a baby and your husband's working 12-hour shifts? That's exactly what happened to someone I know. What made this even more stressful is that she didn't even ask. No heads up. No, "Hey, does this time work for you guys?" Just a text that said something like, "Surprise, we're coming to visit next month. Can't wait to see the baby." Like it was some sort of gift. Now, don't get me wrong. Family visiting can be a wonderful thing, especially if you live far apart and don't see each other often. But this wasn't just a short weekend drop-in. This was 2 full weeks. That's 14 days of sharing your space, your routine, your kitchen, your baby's schedule, without your consent. She planned everything, booked the flights, included her 2 other sons, and then casually let them know after the fact, all without asking, "Is this a good time for your family?" Or even, "Do you have space for us to stay?" Let me paint a clearer picture. The couple had just moved into a small 2-bedroom apartment. 1 room for them, 1 for their newborn baby. That's it. No guest room, no extra space. And yet, the expectation from the mother-in-law was that all 3 of them, she and her 2 sons, would be staying there. It was almost as if she thought the visit itself was a favor, as if just showing up with smiles and luggage somehow meant they were doing something generous. But for a new mother, still adjusting, still recovering emotionally and physically from childbirth, the idea of 3 house guests for 2 weeks wasn't heartwarming. It was terrifying. And here's the worst part. She'd been through this before. The last time her mother-in-law visited, it was during the postpartum period, a time when she was already exhausted, vulnerable, and emotionally fragile. That visit left her at rock bottom, and now it was about to happen all over again. Only this time there was no warning. What's so striking here is how one-sided this decision felt. It wasn't about creating a plan that worked for everyone. It was about what the mother-in-law wanted, about her timeline, her desires, her version of family bonding, with little to no regard for the young mom's mental well-being, or even just her daily reality. And when she told her husband about her concerns, hoping for some support, his response? Well, they live far away, so they want to stay longer. Not, "Are you okay with this?" Not, "How can we make this easier for you?" Just a justification for why it's happening, not an invitation to talk about how she feels. So now she's stuck. No room, no real say, and no way out of something that's going to turn her daily life upside down. All because someone thought a surprise family visit would be cute. What really broke her spirit, though, wasn't just the logistics or lack of space. It was the memory. The memory of how awful it felt last time when her mother-in-law came right after the baby was born. Back then she was still healing, physically and emotionally, sleep-deprived, hormonal, trying to breastfeed, and instead of support, what she got was judgment. Last time, her mother-in-law made comments about how she was holding the baby, whether the baby was being fed enough, and why the house wasn't as clean as it should be. She'd sigh loudly when things weren't done her way, offer unsolicited advice, rearrange things in the kitchen. It felt like she was being graded as a mother in her own home. Now imagine going through that again, but for 2 whole weeks, while your husband is gone 10 to 12 hours a day. That's the part people forget. When someone visits for that long, especially uninvited, it's not just a visit, it becomes work for the host. Cooking, cleaning, entertaining, managing space, and with a baby in the mix, that work triples. She told me that what made it worse this time was knowing that her husband wouldn't even be there to balance things out. He works long shifts, often leaving early and coming home late. That means for the majority of the day it would just be her, alone with the baby and 3 guests, one of whom has a history of being critical and overbearing. And here's the thing, she didn't even feel like she could say no, because the last time she suggested that they might want to get a hotel or an Airbnb, her mother-in-law threw a fit, said it was rude, that they were family and shouldn't have to pay to see their own grandson. That guilt was weaponized, and it worked. So this time she felt trapped. She wasn't just anxious about the logistics, She was dreading the emotional toll. The feeling of walking on eggshells in her own home, of not being able to relax, of spending the day taking care of a baby and trying to avoid conflict at the same time. And no one seemed to care. Not even her husband, who brushed it off with, "They just missed the baby." But she knew deep down that this wasn't just about missing the baby. This was about control, about showing up and taking space in her life without invitation or consideration. And the saddest part, she started to doubt herself. Was she being too sensitive, too cold? Was it wrong to want peace and privacy in her own home? These questions haunted her, because no matter how valid her feelings were, she was made to feel like the bad guy, just for wanting boundaries. So, she found herself stuck in this emotional limbo, torn between her own needs and the pressure to please everyone else. Every part of her body was screaming for space, peace, and control over her own life. But her mind was tangled in guilt. What kind of daughter-in-law says no to a family visit? What kind of person sets boundaries that might make someone feel unwelcome? That guilt is powerful, especially when it's been there for years. See, this wasn't the first time her voice had been pushed to the side. In fact, she'd been trained, over time, to put her comfort last. Small comments like, "You're too sensitive, IR, just go with the flow, it's not a big deal," had built up over time, teaching her that her needs were somehow less valid. But now she had a baby, a tiny, vulnerable human being who depended on her for everything. And slowly she began to ask herself, if I can't protect my peace for myself, shouldn't I at least do it for my child? That question kept her up at night. Evalo, she started imagining the visit, waking up early to cook for 5 people, trying to keep the baby quiet so no one would complain, hiding in the nursery to cry when things got overwhelming, smiling through clenched teeth while pretending she wasn't drowning. But then came this shift. A small, quiet voice in her head that said, "You don't have to do this. You are allowed to say no." It didn't shout. It didn't demand. It just whispered. And she began to listen. She sat down one evening and wrote out how she felt, not to send to anyone, just to see it on paper. She wrote about the last visit, the sleepless nights, the criticism, the loneliness. She wrote about the fear she felt now, and how every part of her was already bracing for another emotional storm. Putting it into words made it real, and with that clarity came the realization. If she didn't speak up now, nothing would change. But even then, fear lingered. Fear of rocking the boat, fear of being labeled difficult or cold, fear of disappointing her husband. She loved him, he was a good man, but he didn't see the weight she was carrying. Maybe because she never let him see it fully. Maybe because she always handled it, until now. And so, she started rehearsing the conversation in her head, over and over, not to fight, not to accuse, but to stand her ground, to say, "I love your family, but I need you to understand what this is doing to me." It wasn't about rejecting family, it was about protecting her energy, her mental health, her ability to show up for her child and for herself. And for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in months: courage. One quiet evening after dinner, she finally gathered enough courage to speak. Her husband was scrolling through his phone on the couch, looking relaxed, completely unaware of the emotional storm brewing inside her. She sat next to him, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her heart was pounding, not because she was angry, but because this conversation mattered. It mattered deeply. "I need to talk to you about your mum's visit," she began, her voice low but steady. He looked up, surprised. "Okay, what about it?" She paused for a long moment. Then, without blaming or accusing, she shared everything. How overwhelmed she had felt the last time. How much pressure she'd been under, trying to heal and host at the same time. how the unannounced nature of this upcoming trip triggered all that anxiety again. And then she said something she had never said out loud before. "I can't do this again, not like this." At first he was quiet, too quiet. Then he sighed and said, "They just want to see the baby, their family. What do you want me to tell them, that they're not welcome?" She bit her lip, feeling the familiar wave of guilt rise up, but she pushed through it. "I'm not asking you to reject your family," she said gently. "I'm asking you to protect our family, me and the baby, by helping us set some boundaries. I need you to see that this isn't just about a visit. It's about how it impacts our home, my mental health, and our child's peace." He frowned, clearly uncomfortable. But for once, she didn't back down. She didn't cry. She didn't soften her voice to make it easier for him. She simply stayed honest. "I'm not saying they can't come, but we need to figure out something different, either a shorter visit or they stay somewhere else, because this is too much for me, and if I don't speak up now, I'll break." There it was, raw and true. He rubbed his forehead, clearly torn. "You know they're going to take this personally." "I know," she replied, "but they'll get over it. I won't if I keep sacrificing myself every time." That night, nothing was fully resolved. He didn't immediately agree, but for the first time she saw him really thinking, processing, not brushing it off. She went to bed with no guarantees, but with something else, a quiet sense of self-respect. She had stood up for herself, not with anger, but with honesty. And maybe that was the first step. Days passed, and the conversation with her husband lingered like a quiet hum in the background. They didn't talk about it every day, but something had shifted. He didn't bring up his mother's travel plans again. He seemed more thoughtful, more careful. But no big announcement came. No one cancelled flights. The visit was still happening. And so, she did something unexpected. She began preparing. Not the way she usually did, scrubbing the house spotless, planning meals, stocking up on snacks, but emotionally. She prepared by letting go of the idea that she had to please everyone. Instead, she focused on setting internal boundaries. If they showed up and expected to stay in her home, she would calmly state, "We only have space for 2 bedrooms, one for the baby and one for us. I'd be happy to help you find a hotel nearby." If they criticized her parenting, she would say, "This is what works for our family." And if it got too loud, too stressful, too invasive, she would take the baby for a walk or go into her room and close the door, not to be rude, but to stay sane. That was her power. She couldn't control them, but she could control how she responded. And in that shift, something strange happened. She began to feel stronger, not because anything outside had changed, but because she had changed inside. The day of the visit came. Her mother-in-law arrived, suitcase in hand, smile wide and excited. The kids barreled through the front door, laughing loudly. Her husband helped them inside, his eyes briefly meeting hers. An unspoken, "Are you okay?" passing between them. She nodded, calm, grounded. As expected, the MIL said, "I can't wait to get settled. Where should we put our bags?" This time, she didn't panic. She said gently but firmly, "Actually, we made arrangements at the hotel nearby. It's just a few blocks away. It'll be more comfortable for everyone." The smile faded for a moment. A pause. But then, to her surprise, no explosion came, just a sigh. And then a reluctant, "Okay, I guess that works." It wasn't easy. The visit still had tense moments, comments, eye rolls, passive-aggressive sighs. But it was different now, because she was different. And as the 2 weeks ended and the house became quiet again, she sat on the couch with her baby in her arms and whispered, "We did it." Not perfectly, not painlessly, but honestly. And that mattered. Because in the end, boundaries aren't about pushing people away. They're about bringing yourself closer to your peace, your power, and your truth. And now I ask you, if you were in her shoes, would you have the courage to do the same?